Um, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay respect to their elders past and present. I'm Peter Murphy from Philippines Australia Union League, I think most of you know. And our guest speaker this evening is Neri Colmenares. He's from the National Union of People's Lawyers in the Philippines, and he's a former congressman for Bayan. His history of activism goes back to the Marcos days. So I think please come and sit down. Our topic tonight really is, what's happened to the Filipino people following the elections in May, which Marcos Jr. became the president, and we have a sort of historical nightmare of the Filipino people that it's all happening again. Hi Peter, hi Jay. Okay, so the format is really simple. I've just asked Neri to speak to that topic, and he could go for half an hour if he wanted to, and we'll have a discussion, and we'll try to finish around 6 or 6:15, and sort of so you have a cut-off point. Okay, so we have a microphone and all that. There's another function going to start, and if it's really noisy, we'll switch this on. Otherwise, I think we're all close enough to be able to hear. Can everyone hear me all right? Yeah. Okay.
Hi, so yes, good afternoon. Thank you for having me here. It's nice to see old friends in Sydney. I just arrived this morning from Melbourne, and then I'll probably go to Canberra and then back to the Philippines. But I'm glad to be here. It's also nice to see new faces, of course, because new faces means there's an expansion somewhere along the way. Well, the topic assigned to me was the current conditions in the Philippines. Marcos II won in a surprising twist of events. In fact, I didn't even expect him to run. Everybody was expecting Sara Duterte, the daughter of President Duterte, to run, and suddenly Marcos comes in, and later we will discuss the elections, but the fact is now Marcos is the president and Sara Duterte is the vice president, the scions of two of the most brutal regimes in Philippine history, Marcos and Duterte. A perfect merger, so to speak, if you're talking about consolidation of corporations. The first thing that is noticeable about Marcos is he never contradicted the human rights and economic policies of Duterte. In fact, he did announce a few continuation of the policies of Duterte, specifically on the International Criminal Court. So what were the policies of President Duterte? Extrajudicial killings, which you probably heard. Duterte became notorious for his extrajudicial killings. According to human rights groups, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Karapatan, so on, at least 25,000 suspected drug suspects were killed in the 6 years of the Duterte reign of terror. The police did not admit or do not admit 25,000 killed. They only admit up to 6,685.
Somehow not as bad.
But it doesn't matter whether it's 25,000 or 6,685. It's just one death too many. And to think these are drug suspects not convicted, and many of them were even suspected not to be involved in drugs. That is why really a lot of countries issued statements of concern during the time. Did Australia issue us? Yes. Good. I'm glad Australia also issued a statement of concern about these raging human rights violations. But the killings did not only stop with drug suspects. It even went further. Political killings took place. A total of 470 political killings happened in the 6 years of Duterte. Many of them human rights defenders, indigenous people, activists, opposition, and human rights lawyers like us, NUPL, the National Union of People's Lawyers, suffered about 4 dead under him. We have 5 dead but the other one was under Arroyo. During his span, 59 lawyers and judges were killed because he said, look, you lawyers and you judges, you acquit drug suspects. But isn't that the mere exercise of your profession? I mean, when you're a lawyer, you're just exercising your profession, and whether or not whatever the crime that client of yours have is just a part of your job. And no lawyer should be killed merely because he or she defended a certain client, whether that client is a suspected drug pusher or drug addict or a political or an activist. Doesn't matter. It's your job. In the same way that media, which is also a victim of attack under Duterte, suffered the same thing. In fact, the Philippines is one of the most dangerous places for journalists. In the same manner that media was merely exercising their profession to be journalists. Whether you like or don't like the article or the story, that's the exercise of constitutional freedom of expression and media. And if you feel you were injured, then you can file a case in court. But you should not kill media people because you didn't like the stories they churn out. So that was the Duterte conditions in the 6 years. And Marcos did not even contradict it, did not even say we will hold you to account for it. At least in Thailand, after the killings by Thaksin, the Prime Minister, when he launched a war on drugs in Thailand also so many years ago, killing also thousands, at least the new government, after Thaksin was overthrown, put up an inquiry which actually found out later that half of those killed by Thaksin in Thailand were not even involved in drugs. But here, there was even no move for accountability and investigation. In fact, he announced he pursued the policy of President Duterte to withdraw from the International Criminal Court merely because President Duterte had a case before the International Criminal Court. We were counsels to one of the case filed, the criminal complaint filed in the International Criminal Court for representing the families of the victims of extrajudicial killings. That was a very tough decision for them. In fact, I personally asked the mothers and the sisters and the daughters and the sons, do you really want to do this? The moment you file this case, there's no turning back. And I still remember the words of the mother and said, attorney, my son is dead. No justice can be had here, and I will, suffer whatever response that they have on us because I want to pursue justice. The issue of International Criminal Court, of course, Duterte suddenly becomes a nationalist. He suddenly becomes a nationalist. Why should foreign judges judge me? I'm a Filipino. I want Filipino courts to judge me. There are two critics immediately to that statement. The first is no Filipino court will even have jurisdiction over him, not only because he controls the investigation, he intimidates the judiciary, but the fact is, according to Philippine jurisprudence, the president is immune from suit. So if any case we file against Duterte at that time will just be dismissed by the judge on the ground that the president is immune from suit. I don't know if the prime minister is immune from suit. No. So your prime minister here can be charged in court. We should take out that provision. But anyway, so really a false, it was intended to delude people as if the justice system and the courts were working marvelously in the Philippines. Well, the second reason, you're turning nationalist. You gave away our islands to China, and then you allow transnational corporations, US, etc., to come in. And by the way, Australian mining firms too, which I'll probably raise later on. And now you're suddenly a nationalist saying, oh, we're Filipinos, no foreigners should come in and judge us. But that's how Duterte ruled, right? He was just making all these sound bites and very popular sayings that will really, Filipino people will say, oh, he's good. He wants to defend Philippine sovereignty. But in action, of course, it's the reverse. Economic policies of Duterte pursued by Marcos, the same neoliberal economic policies, globalization, liberalization, privatization, same thing that has run roughshod over the rights of the Filipino people and the Filipino workers in particular. We're suffering at 7.7% inflation rate right now. And Australia is probably what, 4?
No, we're about 7.
We're about 7%.
Yep.
But last year it was 4.5% inflation rate, and many Filipinos couldn't even afford to buy the basic necessities of life. And can you imagine a 7.7% in the Philippines in the midst of poverty? The daily wage in the Philippines is the highest is the National Capital Region, which is Manila, 570 pesos a day, which is roughly, in my translation, about 15 Australian dollars per day. Not per hour, per day. How can you live with... That's the minimum wage. And the worst part is, that's in Metro Manila. The further you get from Metro Manila, the less your wages are, on the premise, the government said, that the standard of living is less in the provinces. So for Filipinos like me who come from the provinces, that's really unfair and unjust. The price of commodities in the malls is the same as the price of commodities in Metro Manila. In fact, the price of gasoline and fuel in the provinces is higher than in Metro Manila. So why this treatment of regionalization of wages? That's the policy we want the government to overturn. The regionalization of wages to be decided by a tripartite regional body composed of government, employers, and workers, wherein each region has a different way of interpreting their wage levels. But that's the case. Workers are now demanding, in my estimate, about 891 Australian dollars per month. That's a lot less than Australian minimum wage, but still, if given to the Filipino workers, that at least it will catch up with the living wage, which we call in the Philippines, the living wage of a family of 5. But government is not giving in to that. So the poverty incidence in the Philippines is very high. It's 18% they say, although we tend to question that because we think it's higher than that. What's the threshold of Philippine poverty incidence? It's an equivalent of about 325 Australian dollars per month. Anyone earning 325 Australian dollars per month, that's my rough translation of 37 pesos to 1 Australian dollar, is poor. Anyone earning above 325 Australian dollars per month is no longer poor. Where's the logic there? Meaning to say, if you're earning 400 Australian dollars a month, you're no longer poor. Of course you're still poor, even if you earn $500 a month. That's not enough to really take care of the needs of the family. So the health system there is totally, when Filipinos get sick, and I see some Filipinos over here, when Filipinos get sick in the Philippines, it's a medical crisis. You cannot afford to send your mother gets sick, your father gets sick, your son, daughter get. Filipinos in Australia, they have to double, triple what they send just to ensure that at least basic health services are provided in their family, because it's a privatized situation. Government has been privatizing a lot of sectors, privatizing a lot of government assets. Sometimes when I'm interviewed by the media, I tell government, so you don't want to, you keep on selling government properties, you want to privatize all these functions. Why did you even run for a political position? You should not have run. Let's privatize the entire government if that's what we're going to. You keep on running, and yet you keep on shredding the functions and privatizing it. And of course, we all know that when you privatize something, of course, the corporation's main interest is not public service. Profit is the main motivation, and public service is just an afterthought. So this is a really brutal combination of inflationary rates, low wages, and dismal social services, health, education, etc. And to think corruption is rampant in government in the Philippines. And in fact, to a large part, our poverty is also caused by the by the corruption of government, who steals. Look, pork barrel in the Philippines, I would presume it was 25 million pesos billion pesos during when the time I was in Parliament, in Congress. Now it's probably gone up to about 60 to 70 billion pesos. Where members of Congress and the senators give out projects like, I keep on telling my colleagues at the time, why do we even have projects? The function of a legislator is to pass laws. We're not here to medical, put up clinics or, and the moment it's pork barrel, discretion is with that government official. And when government has discretion over a large amount of money, corruption sets in. So really, this kind of policies, economic policies, and transnational corporations, of course, which has, all governments in the Philippines have always said that foreign investments, they're the path to the future. We've always said, been there, done that. All presidents since Marcos, Arroyo, Aquino, Duterte, until Duterte, and now Marcos II, every time they go abroad, when they return to the Philippines, they say, oh, I brought with me $100 million of investment, $200 million of investment. They probably have racked up about trillions and trillions of dollars of investment in the last so many decades, and yet the lives of the Filipino people remain dismal. Because foreign investment is not the answer to the Filipino economic conditions. Of course, we will have trade, but that's the secondary engine of growth. The primary engine of growth is for us to industrialize, for us to produce what we need, rather than us to produce what other countries need. We produce the copra, the abaca, the pineapple, the sugar, and the coconut. And the question is, who produces our needs? These big countries say, no, don't worry, we will produce your needs. Just keep on producing our needs. So they produce the t-shirts and the lights and everything we have. But, we can't survive like, you sell one coconut, you buy one electric fan. Of course, you're going to lose that way. Right? You're going to sell banana, you buy one aircon. You're going to be poor. That's the system imposed on us by these transnational corporations, big governments. So I have to be honest here. Some transnational corporations and Australian corporations have been involved in mining operations in the Philippines. And the famous one is Oceana, who was charged. It's mining gold in an indigenous people's area somewhere in the north. And it's just destroying the ancestral domain and the rivers. You all know what mining leads to. Productivity of the lands were affected because of these mine tailings, and even noise pollution. Because when we went there to research on the cause of action as lawyers, for them, noise pollution is bad because I didn't know about that. When you're mining a certain period, there's a lot of machinery going on, the dust, and human rights violations. Many of those whose houses are part of the mining claim, the security guards of the company or the military or the police burn their houses, So things like this. That's why it's something that we're discussing with the Melbourne, some Australian friends in Melbourne, and I'm sure here in Sydney too, on how to resolve that. And we're looking for a lawyer to file a case against Oceana Gold here in Australia, because I doubt very much under Marcos if we can gain headway against big corporations like Oceana Gold. In fact, a lot of our workers there are having a lot of problems going after small companies. How much more if you're going up against big companies? So yes, unemployment is high and so on. I don't need to. But the other problem I'd like to raise with regards labor workers situation is the violation of labor rights. Unions are getting smaller because of contractualization. where you are employed not as an employee but as a contract, and therefore if you're a contractual employee, which you're probably familiar here in Australia, if that also takes place here, of course you can't become part of the union because you're just a contract, and every time you complain they can just take out your contract, end your contract, that's it, no more security of tenure. So that practically diminished the power of the union to defend workers. And when workers complain, extrajudicial killings happen, and trump-up cases were filed. In fact, the 1st of May movement labor union, the international officer, Kara, she's a young union worker. She was arrested I think she was about to attend the ITUC convention in Melbourne. But because she was arrested and detained on a case of illegal assault, yeah, stuff like that. So there are many workers, and Peter was even telling me just now that another worker was arrested, and I said I probably read about it, but we almost daily we get this in our phone. This worker was arrested, this peasant was arrested, so on. So we cannot keep up with who's arrested and who's killed and who's in prison. So that's the condition of the working class in the Philippines. And so the farmers, the same, because of trade liberalization law, cheap rice came in. We're importing almost everything, and to think we're supposed to produce rice, why are we importing rice from China and Vietnam and even Thailand? You know, because I noticed that during when we had a congressional investigation, there is corruption in the transaction. You buy 200,000 tons of rice. There's an overpricing somewhere. You discuss this with the Chinese or the Vietnamese, and then there's overpricing. So they earn from that. So we're making the Chinese and the Vietnamese and the Thai and the other countries richer, while impoverish the Filipino peasants. In fact, there are demands right now is that the government give aid and lower the value-added tax on fuel, because fuel has increased. The government way of explaining inflation and economic problems is the usual suspect, Ukraine. But it's not really the main reason. In fact, long before Ukraine, our people are poor. And long before Ukraine, our fuel prices are very high because it's a non-transparent system. Every time the international oil price increased, the oil companies, Caltex, Shell, Chevron, they all say, we have to increase. But you know what? When I was in Congress, I asked them, what is the composition of your price? There are two sets of prices here. First is the landed cost, international price, freighting, insurance, and then it lands. That's what we know. We know about this because international price, we know about that. But the cost from here to here, we don't know that in the Philippines. I don't know if you know about that in Australia. The oil depot, the freighting, the salaries, the advertisement, and all these things until you get to the gas station and sell it for, in the Philippines, it's 70 to 80 pesos per liter. So how did we even know if it's overpriced? We don't know the cost. If we know the total cost per liter, then we could say, oh, that's overpriced, or that's not overpriced. But since we don't know the other half, and thirdly, we are asking that the government take away the value-added tax. Value-added tax is a regressive form of taxation, and maybe I think it was an issue here before with your GST.
Still is,
yeah, it's a regressive form of taxation. The Philippine Constitution says progressive taxation. Why is it regressive? Well, if a poor tricycle driver, cab driver will buy 1 liter of fuel to go around, feed his family, earn a living, he pays 12% tax. If a rich billionaire buys 1 liter of fuel to go around and see the sights, and pays 12%. So we're saying, look, can you take that out? But they won't, because there are no funds. The only problem, now I go to one of the last issues I'll raise with you, and that's on the issue of debt. When President Duterte came to power in 2016, the total debt of the Philippines was 6.5 trillion pesos. I don't know how much that Australian dollars, but 37 pesos to the dollar, 6.5 trillion. When he left, this 2022, it was 13.4 trillion pesos. So he practically doubled the entire debt of the country. And this 6.5 trillion were the total debts of the country, 8 presidents. From Marcos to Aquino to Arroyo and then single president. And he keeps on saying COVID. COVID is a very disastrous thing for many people, but it was a good thing for some. Because it explains everything. Oh, you know, because of COVID, oh, we spent a lot because of COVID. And when we trace the total expenses of Duterte for COVID response, it was 570 billion pesos. And yet you borrowed like 7 trillion pesos. Where did the money go? So we're asking government to account for it rather than just keep on saying we don't have money, we don't have funds. And lastly, the Marcoses did not pay even their estate tax of 203 billion pesos. Can you imagine that? You're the president, you're supposed to order the workers, the teachers, the government employees, you pay your taxes. And yet here, one of the richest families in the Philippines not paying billions of pesos in taxes. I tried to calculate it, that 203 billion, if only the Marcoses will pay that, can fund about 1 billion liters of fuel, which can be given for free to all the cab drivers, the jeepney drivers, the bus drivers, and they can do their work for without any expenses for a year or two, free gasoline. So this is a recipe for more poverty in the Philippines, and the problem there is the repression even continues, because when people protest, the government's reaction is always repression. So Marcos was barely 100, 200 days maybe in office, but not only did he not contradict the economic policies and human rights policies of Duterte, he continued it. Extrajudicial killings in the first 100 days under Marcos, we have already 10 cases of extrajudicial killings. It's not as much as Duterte's 25,000 or 6,685, but it's an ominous sign of things to come. 4 cases of enforced disappearances, 39 cases of illegal arrests and detentions in the first 100 days. So we have here a combination of rapacious tyrants, families who have been intolerant of dissent in the Philippines and have led to the deaths and incarceration of thousands upon thousands of Filipinos, including, of course, workers and peasants. And we really are hoping that with a unified struggle, we can overcome this. Now let's go to the election. Did Marcos legitimately win the 2022 elections? First, long before the elections, we were trying to get the ill-gotten wealth of the Marcoses because we know it will fund his personal electoral campaign. But we failed to do so. That the Marcoses have ill-gotten wealth is already, there's a Supreme Court decision that already said you have ill-gotten wealth. That's why the Supreme Court once forfeited $650 million US dollars, which was returned by Swiss banks. So that one already, for me, delegitimizes the victory. If you're going to use people's money in your personal electoral campaign, that should be illegal. But we never got to getting those funds from him. Secondly, we were under attack under Duterte, and that unevens the playing field immediately because the opposition is under attack. Our political party and the opposition, red tagging, killings, extrajudicial killings, arrests, trump-up cases. How can you survive an electoral campaign if this? I mean, if the Liberal Party or the Labour Party of Australia would be subjected to extrajudicial killings of their members, it's really difficult for that particular party to win. Because your members would be scared, how can you campaign, right? So that's the problem we had during those attacks. And then social media manipulation. I don't know if you believe in that, but I'm now convinced that social media manipulation can really influence minds. And we never expected that, because I talked with a media expert and he said they were actually doing this micro-targeting. I'm illiterate in technology. Micro-targeting for years, since 2011, 2012, in view of the 2016 run of Marcos for the vice presidency. But he lost the vice presidency in 2016, so they continued using the social media manipulation up to 2022. So it was micro-targeted. He said they profiled everybody, they know your profile, you will not receive their propaganda. Because, oh, Neri Colmenares, his human rights, his etc., etc. But they will target workers, farmers, especially OFW, overseas Filipino workers. Because overseas Filipino workers, the only connection of overseas workers here from the Philippines in Australia or Middle East or Hong Kong, wherever, is social media. That's the only connection they have with the Philippines. They learn things through social media. And if they control social media back there, then they practically control the messaging. So the social media manipulation took place, and we were so surprised when later on people began talking about martial law under Marcos was the golden era. How can one of the most brutal, one of the bloodiest chapters in Philippine history be the golden era? But that's what happened. So it's a combination of this, and then of course there were reports of vote buying. Vote buying was really rampant. That's an admitted fact. There are lots of cases on that. Whether it reached up to Marcos, I couldn't prove it, but billions of pesos in vote buying happened. And suspicion, of course, in electronic fraud. Electronic fraud is something that we always are afraid of, because the Philippine automation system is very untransparent. In fact, you don't know what's happening. There are two basic elements in the right to suffrage in the Philippines or in Australia or everywhere else. The two basic elements is secret voting and public counting. But in the Philippines, it's the reverse. The ballots were so huge, people would know who you voted for, but it's secret counting. So it's public voting and secret counting, which we believe is a violation of the constitutional right to suffrage. But that's how it happened, and I have to admit, it's so untransparent we couldn't get proof. But there are lots of suspicion of not just social media manipulation, but also electronic cheating. Be that as it may, the main issues now, however, is this. The main issue now is the inflation, the low wages, the violation of labor rights, the violation of human rights of the Filipino people, the continuing extrajudicial killings, and the extreme poverty that we're suffering. That's why I guess we just have to go to countries like Australia and gather the solidarity support from other peoples throughout the world to ensure that the human rights violations will not continue our country. But more importantly, also, I'd like to raise this. There is a level of military aid being given to the Philippines. Of course, the United States takes the cake. I mean, they give more military aid than any other country. But Australia does too. And I really hope that there should be some accountability on the issue of military aid, at least by Australia. Where does it really go to? Why should we spend taxpayers' money, Australian taxpayers' money, to fund an armed forces of the Philippines well known for human rights violations? A police that is brutal in killing thousands of Filipinos. I'm sure not a single Australian taxpayer would want to spend one taxpayer's dollar to buy some bullets or whatever to fund a brutal armed forces. And we hope this can be also at the very least accounted for. Where does it really go? Because they kept on saying it's just for training, and Was it used to buy? Because these things aggravate the conditions in the Philippines. We'd rather have the aid go to more important social services in Australia. So basically, that's the condition in the country, and we had a lot of success in that election in the sense that millions of people turned out in the rallies and the campaign that we launched. And I hope that will serve as a foundation for future actions. The millions of people can be translated to very organized opposition to whatever corruption or abuse of power committed by the Marcos and the Duterte administration. And I'm very sure that Marcos is aware of this power of the Filipino people. In fact, Marcos was one of the most powerful dictators in the world at the time, and during martial law. He was the executive because he is the president. He issued laws, therefore he was also the legislature. And he also issued warrants of arrest, therefore he was also the judiciary. Marcos had 3 branches of government under him at the time. But one fateful day of 1986, the Filipino people stood up and said enough. And one of the most powerful dictators in the world bit the dust, was overthrown by the Filipino people. So we continue to believe that the Filipino people will continue to work for a better society, for reforms in our country, and together with the support of friends from trade union and other peoples around the world, we will be able to achieve that reform that we have so long dreamed of. And we will win. We will win this fight for a better Philippines because we believe that we are on the side of the just, we are on the side of the truth, and we are on the side of the people. Maraming salamat po. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Neri. It's time for questions or comments or whatever. Just indicate to me, and Edwin is first.
Can you tell us the background about this mandamus filed with the Supreme Court about the electronic?
Yeah. Well, I wasn't part of the legal team, but I know the lawyers there. The petition is for the Supreme Court to order the Commission on Election and Smartmatic, which is a foreign company, by the way, that it owns the machines, the automated machines, not to destroy the data in the machine. Because usually the problem is after the election they will try to, have a sunset thing, like, oh, we will have to take out the data, so that's what the mandamus is. So if they win that case and the Supreme Court orders Smartmatic and the Commission on Elections, don't destroy the data, preserve it so it can be studied and scrutinized, the votes and the counting and so on, then that's one way we can find out whether electronic cheating took place. The only problem is even if it's preserved, can we have access? Because Smartmatic, the owner of the machine, said this is a proprietary thing. We own this, so you can't just come in and open it up.
Peter? Peter?
Yep. In relation to the anti-terrorism law, and the case, I think it was a regional trial court case which found that the Communist Party of the Philippines is not a terrorist organization, but an organization involved in rebellion. Can you tell us about that in terms of Australia's role in assisting, I guess, the Philippine legislature
Yes.
in drafting the definitions of terrorism and the so-called protections?
Yes. So I'll answer that in 2 points. The first is the court case itself, and the second point is Australia's role. Court case itself. Department of Justice files a petition under the anti-terrorism law against the Communist Party of the Philippines and the New People's Army for them to be proscribed as terrorist organizations. The first thing they did, other than that, they also included 800 individuals in the case. So, and I think that was one of their first mistakes. When the CPP-NPA was charged for proscription, of course, the CPP, the Communist Party, and the New People's Army did not send their lawyers Not only do they not recognize the judicial process of the Philippines that can endanger the lives of their lawyers. So there was no defense there. However, the government also charged 800 people, absurdly saying, "Oh, you're communist, you're terrorists," and so on, including a Filipino who was the UN Special Rapporteur in Indigenous People, some lawyers, some professors. Really, until the judge said, "Look, where's your evidence? Did they kill anybody? They have guns, they have explosive?" No evidence whatsoever, so the judge began dismissing the 800 cases. Until in the end, only 2 were left, and then the CPP and PA. So it was an ex parte hearing, and for non-lawyers, ex parte means only one side was heard. Because the other side was not presenting evidence. No, they don't have a lawyer. So in the end, under the terrorism law, the old terrorism law, there are 2 elements there. First, that the terrorist group committed acts of violence. And the purpose is to intimidate government, influence government to commit an unlawful act. The 2 elements are necessary because an act of violence is committed by almost everybody. World War I, World War II, of course. Countries go to war. And just because you went to war, just because you used violence, you're immediately a terrorist. That's not the case. So the second element is important. Just establishing, so the court said, okay, did the CPP NPA commit violence? Yes. They ambushed the military, they ambushed the police, they killed, and so on. So that's that. It's there. So she went to the second element, because if the second element cannot be established, then if only the first element, the use of weapons, guns, against an enemy, then that falls under the Geneva Convention, international humanitarian law that regulates war among nations and among governments and rebels. When she went to the second element, she read all the literature and even those submitted by government. She said, what's the purpose of the Communist Party? The purpose, they're asking government for agrarian reform, take out contractualization, increase wages, stuff like that. So she said, so what's unlawful there? Isn't this a constitutional right? So in the end, while she searched for the literature, including those submitted by the military and the government, she couldn't find any unlawful demand. So she said, the second element falls. And because the second element falls, they are not demanding from government something unlawful, something terroristic, then they're not terrorists. So that's very humiliating to the government because first, the enemy, the opponent didn't even present their evidence. They didn't even have a lawyer. You're the only one presenting evidence, and yet you lost. And the second thing was they were surprised. I was surprised too. I don't know the judge, and I was surprised with her courage, so to speak. In fact, she was immediately red tagged. Red tagging is probably when the government style of calling people, you're a communist. In the Philippines, it's not a simple thing like, you're a communist. In the Philippines, you die if you're red tagged. Many of those who were red tagged were killed eventually by the death squads. So it's a very dangerous form of libel, actually. It's not a simple libel. Anyway, so I guess the government lost the round there, but they're not going to appeal. So, it has become final. But they're going to file, I think, if I'm their lawyer, and that's what they'll think, they're going to refile a new case under the new anti-terror law, which is more draconian.
Yeah.
So, but as of now, the judicial system of the Philippines has declared them non-terrorist. That's why I raised it with an MP from New Zealand. I said, I didn't say it directly. You're more popish than the Pope, because New Zealand listed the CPNP as terrorists. The judiciary of the Philippines said they're not terrorists. So how come New Zealand says they are? Because we want peace process in the Philippines, and because we want peace process in the Philippines, this terrorism tagging dislocates the peace process. Because If they're terrorists, then by policy, government should not sit down with them to talk peace. And of course, the communists and the NPA will not sit down with government because you're calling me a terrorist. But the Filipino people hunker for peace for a long period of time. And what we're saying is, you just sit down, address the roots of the conflict. Why is there a war in the Philippines? It's not because some members of the rebel groups, I just want to kill government troops today. It's my trip. I just like to kill. No, people fight against government, live a difficult life in the mountains. No wages, you can't see your family, you could die when you get sick, there's no hospital. Why would you do that? There has to be a reason that pushes people to rebel. And for us, the roots of the conflict is injustice, poverty, discrimination, all the socialists that lead people to rebel against government. And what government can do and should do is to discuss this and let's address this. The moment it's addressed, then I'm very sure no one will rebel against government if you're earning better wages, if there's justice in the country. So that's precisely, and the moment terrorist tagging comes in, it derails peace process, which we've always wanted to achieve for a long period of time. That's what I said to the New Zealand MPs from Labour and Greens and so on. Help us achieve peace process. Do not go with this trend of terrorist tagging because anyway, the second part, Australian involvement, we filed a petition to declare the unconstitutional the anti-terror law. 37 petitions were filed from church, really a broad spectrum of people filing opposition to the terror law. Lawyers, integrated bar. Can you imagine the integrated bar? They're very conservative lawyers normally because they're the bar. But they also filed. So we were there, about 5 of us were selected by the 37 petitioners to represent them in oral arguments, and we argued orally before the court. The Solicitor General, in his defense, mentions Australia about 6 or 8 times. I was so surprised. But you see, how can our law be draconian? The Australian law is in fact worse. So I had to study the Australian law. That was the longest oral argument in my life. About 8 days. 8 days of oral arguments before the Supreme Court.
Do you have
And
a
we-
transcript?
Pardon?
Do you have a transcript?
So,
Presentation.
and I became interested in it suddenly in Australian law. I was telling you about this. I was invited to be part of the Council of the International Bar Association, and there was an Australian there who headed the council. So I asked him, Justice Michael Kirby.
Ah, yes.
Yeah, so in fact I wrote him just now a few weeks ago and said, are you here? I'll meet you, have coffee. But anyway, yeah, he said the terror law that we're probably reading is the one passed initially during the attacks, because there had been some amendments. But anyway, doesn't matter because he said, okay, we admit the Australian law is probably worse, we don't know. But if it's worse, why should we follow? If China detains persons for 1,000 days, we should also detain accused for 900 days without charges and say, well, China was worse, so this one is good. Of course not. So we kept on. And the last argument we had with the anti-terror law is this: do they really need this against terrorists? You see, in the Philippines, the war against their supposed terrorists they've been going after has been going on ruthlessly for so many years. When they see an Abu Sayyaf, they would shoot the Abu Sayyaf. They wouldn't go and say, oh, I can't arrest him because there's no anti-terror law. The military is not obsessed with laws there. In fact, in the Philippines, you're a mere drug suspect, you die. How much more if you're a terrorist suspect? They don't need warrants of arrest and so on when they arrest people in the Philippines. So why this sudden obsession with an anti-terrorism law? As if the military always wants, the police always wants a legal basis for all their action. But they never really needed legal basis before. And that's how we argued before the court. This law was not really intended for the terrorists. They don't need these laws for the so-called terrorists. They need these laws for the activists, for the opposition, for ordinary people who do not go into the ambit, the connection under the terrorism law, but they would, because it's overbroad and vague. I mean, the definition of terrorism is a terrorist act is an act intended to. So you're not being penalized by what you did, but what you intend. Can you imagine that? You go to prison because the police say, oh, you intended to do this. You really, I don't know if Australian law is worse. I think we're worse, but that's not a competition I'd like to win.
Well, I think I've read it. I mean, a large part of the Philippine law is borrowed from the same language in the Australian law, and you've probably seen that. And
we
there's just some minor tweaks and changes that about the Philippine context. Really, it's not about the law.
So that means you have a lot of work to do here to reform your terror law. We can join together a common effort to have reforms on that side.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah.
Some more questions or comments?
In talking about the peace process, you know, that, is that going anywhere? I mean, the government, Filipino government and the NPA, I mean, this started long ago, but
Yes, well, Duterte had this process before,
he killed it, right? So, but,
you know,
but
and
is
he
there any
demanded.
chance or any use to having some sort of revival of that process at all?
Yes, well, Marcos hasn't announced his policy. Have you heard it? He hasn't announced anything on that. Will he do that? Will he have conduct peace process in the Philippines? Maybe he will. We don't know. Well, any Filipino president who managed to achieve peace in the Philippines will probably be one of the most popular presidents in our history because, you know, it stopped a war. But I don't see any move towards that. The church people, mainly the church people in the Philippines, and some lawyers like us, human rights, are moving for peace talks because they, you know, it's understandable. We want peace in our country, but peace that must be just and lasting, because peace process without addressing the roots of the conflict is just. So yeah, I also hope that there will be some support in calling for peace. You know, in Australia too. You see, when human rights violations like under Duterte takes place, or massive, massive attacks take place, then the call for peace can be amplified by your movements here. Who knows, maybe one of your MPs will file a resolution to express the sense. The resolutions are not laws, right? So it's easily passed. At the height of Duterte, there were some resolutions in Parliament passed in some countries because it's just a resolution expressing the sense of the Parliament that human rights violations are taking place and we are concerned. Or human rights violations are taking place and we hope there will be a peace, you know, some peace, things like that. It's just a resolution. We can also, of course, request that later on. But yeah, I see no movement towards that. Although there are a lot of people hoping that there will be some peace process, of course, that will take place.
Okay, some more. Maria.
What sort of opposition is there to the regime of Duterte now?
The opposition, when we lost the election, we lost heavily. I was one of those who ran for the Senate, and we all lost. Only one from our slate managed to win a seat. Of course, Vice President Robredo ran for president, lost. Senator Kiko Pangilinan ran for vice president, lost. All of us. Although I was informed I won in Australia.
Yeah.
They said I won in Australia. So you're a senator here, Neri. The Filipinos here, not the Australians. The Filipinos here voted for Lenny, for, you know, the opposition. Thank you very much for all the campaign. But anyway, Everybody was depressed after the election and so on. Everybody shocked. And that's what I told people in the Philippines and even here. Well, you can cry for maybe a month. Okay, give it 2 months. But you can't go on crying for 3 months. There are lots of tasks to be done. I've always said there are 3 gains in the last election. That I've always stressed that. There were 3 gains. Don't you see any gains here? The first gain was that it was an electoral mass movement. Never before in the history of the country have we seen an electoral mass movement than that in 2022. Millions of people mobilized. When I speak before a stage, 500,000 people, 700,000 people. I mean, I haven't seen that.
Yeah, that's amazing.
I haven't seen that in elections in the entire history of our country. In fact, I haven't seen that in many countries as well. I don't know if Lula managed to achieve that in Brazil, but it's really a difficult thing to achieve. Isn't that a major gain? These people are not only saying, well, I support the opposition, I'll vote for Leni Robredo, I'll vote for Neri. No, they said, I'll vote for them, but I also go house-to-house campaigning. Can you imagine a house-to-house in the Philippines? Only activists do house-to-house in the Philippines because it's a very difficult thing to do. It's hot, or it's raining, cats and dogs, and sometimes the police will harass you, or you get into debates with. It's a very difficult thing to do, and yet that was a higher level of commitment on the part of the supporters of the opposition during the time. We only got 13 million to 15 million votes. Yes, but that 13 to 15 million is huge potential. So that was the first gain. What was the second gain? The second gain was never before in our history has there been so many people aware of martial law, aware of the evils of the Marcoses than now. The only time that martial law, more people were aware of martial law and the Marcoses and the evil and the plunder was during EDSA, the first people power that overthrew Marcos. But after EDSA, when he was overthrown, it dwindled from there. Why? Because our Philippine government refused to teach the next generation of Filipinos about what happened during martial law. Why did the government do that? Why is it, unlike Germany, where they taught the next generation about Holocaust and so on, why did they do that? Because the architects of martial law were in government at the time. Enrile, who was the defense minister of Marcos, became also the defense secretary of the next government, the post-Marcos government, as a form of political convenience. General Ramos, who headed the armed forces the police of Marcos, was the head of the armed forces at the time of Cory. So never before has it happened that more people in the millions, every martial law anniversary, we go out every year during the anniversary. We talk to people and about martial law, what happened there, the human rights violation. But we're talking to 200 people, 300, 400. Now, when we talk about martial law and even hundreds of thousands were listening, this is a very major gain. Why should we even be depressed? This is a major gain. And of course, as I mentioned, the third gain is social media warriors. There was a big social media force during the election. And the messaging was not disciplined, but if you can harness it, it becomes a big force. So yeah, for me, in fact, I was proposing for a long time now that we should build a coalition for accountability and checks and balance. Because in the Philippines today, checks and balance and accountability is highly compromised. Marcos and Duterte has appointed practically almost all government officials in the Philippines. In the Senate and the House, they have the super majority. We have 24 senators and only 2 senators are deemed to be opposition. In the House, it's more than that, almost 90%. Only a few of us who won in. And the Supreme Court is intimidated by Marcos and Duterte. I mean, Duterte took out the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and if you don't get intimidated with that. So all judges below the Chief Justice are now afraid because Marcos appointed the Commission on Election. the Commission on Audit and the Civil Service Commission. One of the rare moments in Philippine history in one administration appointed all the commissioners of the body that supervises our election, all the members of the body that audits all government transactions, and all the commissioners or heads of the commission that decides who is out, suspended, or expelled from government, the Civil Service Commission. In fact, Marcos and Duterte has already appointed or will be appointing all the members of the Commission on Human Rights. So where is accountability going to come from when the constitutional checks and balances no longer exist? It has to come from the people. And that proposal of mine, that let's build an accountability coalition, a mechanism that will demand accountability and checks and balances from government. I mean, there are 15 million who voted for the opposition. If we can only get like 200,000 of that to form part of that coalition, that's a huge power on the part of the people to hold government to account. Yeah, so while we were distraught when the Marcoses won in the last election, the potential and the base for a strong people's movement is there if only we can harness the strength of the opposition that was shown during the elections.
Are you optimistic?
I am an eternal optimist. I was an activist way back in 1980s. I was arrested at the age of 18 in 1978. I'm still a human rights advocate now, so I am an optimist. Otherwise, I would have gone away and went to sleep. Yes.
Yes. About the West Philippine Sea. So I heard from the news, the ABS-CBN news, that Marcos is posturing himself to be really standing for the decision of the court, the arbitration on the maritime boundaries between China and the Philippines. And also, he said that they will issue a non-verbal, whatever that means, with regards to that part of like a rocket that has been found in the Philippine, boundary, where they found out that this rocket, piece of that rocket, is actually from China. And then the Chinese Coast Guard has forcibly taken it. And then now that actually is the point of discussion. And Marcos was saying that he will, in his trip to Beijing, he will discuss the management of the boundaries and how both countries can benefit.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know what note verbal is also, but if you listen to the words note, so it's just a note, and verbal is just a hey mate. It's nothing. So yeah, both President Duterte and President Marcos will play the cards. Duterte will say, I'm more, China, but he also played US. Marcos will say US, but he will play China. Anyway, for me, the West Philippine Sea or the South China Sea, I mean, that's the concern of all, the South China Sea. Yeah, China has really been allowed by the Philippine government. There was a joint exploration between the Philippine government and China under Arroyo. That's another story. I'll tell it. It's a long story, but anyway. Yeah, so I guess, I don't trust government's pronouncements here anymore because they say something and they do another. So I guess the problem now is that China has already installed military installations there. So our demand, the Philippines, is that at least the West Philippine Sea, that part of South China Sea, which is we claim, of course, China should not be there. But we cannot oust one bully and allow another bully to come in. The US would come in. So we're saying preserve that for us. But the only way for that to happen, and this is just my proposal, first there must be a demilitarization of the South China Sea. That's my opinion. demilitarization, meaning all military bases and installations out of the South China Sea. China, Philippines, Vietnam, does Australia have? No, Australia doesn't have. It just
Malaysia, and
Malaysia some.
USA.
Yeah, all demilitarized. Once they're all demilitarized, then we sit down and talk. As long as China's military superiority in the South China Sea, it will not talk on equal terms. But take note, as I mentioned, it should not be you get China out, then you allow US in. It's the same, right? So as I've always said, for the Filipinos, we should have an independent foreign policy. Hindi maka-Amerikano, hindi maka-Chino, kundi maka-Pilipino. So yeah, it's a bit of a problem, and I guess we have to do something about it. But for now, our Philippine government, I don't see them reclaiming our claims, our victory in the West Philippine Sea from China.
Yeah, and Marcos is posturing himself that he is pro-fisher folk in the West Philippine Sea, and he's so concerned that they've lost
Yes.
their income and etc.
You used a good term. You used a good term, posture. You know, when somebody takes picture of you, you just post about your best side. So that's how it is. Yeah, but I guess there will be no advance there. It will be settled some other day, some other time, and it needs a multilateral body, a multilateral involvement between various countries in Asia to go about that.
Okay, we've gone a fair way now. It's 6:20, so maybe we can finish and you can individually chat with Neri. But let's say one more round of applause and thank Neri very much for his time with us.